Nice to meet you all. This has been it's been on my bucket list a little while to come to the Melbourne CocoaHeads. I'd say this counts as halfway. Hopefully you can make it the whole way at some point once this is all over. But thanks again for having me, and thanks again to Matt Dells for suggesting I give this a shot. So today I'd like to talk to you about a little thing I've been working on for the last year. Basically, I've got a lot of stuff that I've been working on, and I've been playing with a thing called Buildkite, and I'll talk a little bit in a sec. Basically what I've learned in this whole process. But just as a quick disclaimer, forewarning and all that, I have no idea what I'm doing for most of the time. I basically came to this conclusion by stumbling around in the dark aimlessly. So maybe there's a better way of doing it out there. In fact, I'm guessing there probably is a better way out there. So I'd love to hear your feedback at the end of this presentation about what could be done better. But in any case, this is what I've come up with on my own. I'd love to share it with all of you. So I do a lot of open source components for iOS. A lot of them are UI. Some of them are backend things, but most of them are UI. Things like I made a photo cropper in a photo cropping library, which has been actually used in quite a few major apps, which is quite nice. I made a passcode. I made a ripoff of the lock screen passcode, which was good at the start, but apparently no one can use it because Apple keeps rejecting it for being a security breach. And the last thing I made was I built was a library that basically just watches the hard drive of any iOS device and then triggers off notification whenever the user does something via some external file access endpoint, like in the Files app or through iTunes, and then triggers a notification in your app to let you know that a file's been modified. But the question is, why do you even bother just open sourcing this kind of stuff? Well, the main thing is I like open sourcing things because if I had to go through the effort to actually do this, clearly it meant that no one else had done it or had open sourced it. Usually that means it's either a niche or either it was a terrible idea. It was such a terrible idea that no one thought it was a good idea to do it in the first place. Either way, I'm happy to accommodate either of those. Because I invest the time in making something like this, I'd like to think that by adding it to the community, I'm also adding to my own value that I'm not going to be the only one using this code. Other people can use it. So thankfully, it helps justify the time I spent actually working on these things. It also gives me motivation to go the extra mile, things like actually thinking about the API design, adding comments, documenting and all that, just to actually improve the quality. So it helps me motivate myself to make it actually good. And these days, when you're working on any kind of software, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We've basically we've had people before us actually come through and give us libraries that we're already taking advantage of. And the idea is, as long as you're using someone else's library, it kind of behooves us. We should all be chipping in because we're all in this together, chipping in and contributing our own software to this greater pool that we can use. The problem is, what's the catch with this? The main catch is the extra overhead of managing open source software is it does cut into time. Things that if you weren't actually managing separate repos over and over again, this all sorts of adds up. For example, whenever you want to cut a release in open source, there's a bare minimum of things you have to do. The first one is you have to do you have to manually tag the release in Git. You have to update the pod. If you're supporting CocoaPods, you have to update the pod spec file with that tagged version. Then you have to push it to trunk in CocoaPods. If you're supporting Carthage, you need to have a dynamic or static framework. So you need to have a build target for frameworks. And this is, I'd say this is kind of necessary in this day and age. You also need to have a changelog where you've actually kept track of every single change you've added. But all these things add up. And the more repos you start having, the more projects you start having, this starts to compound itself. And it got to a point where I was starting to get kind of lazy and eschew trying to avoid cutting new releases. Like people would file pull requests and say, "Hey, could you push a new release, please?" And I was starting to go like, "Oh, but it's so much effort. I don't know. Can we wait for a few more releases, a few more features to add before I push a release?" And then finally, at the start of last year, I kind of hit this point where I was like, "That does it. I kind of need a new process. Doing this manually is crazy." And so I started looking at how I'd actually automate this process. Now, originally I was looking at Travis. Travis is a pretty good one, but at the same time, there was a few things that were kind of eking me out. The main was, since a lot of these do still require private management and these things cost money, there was the pricing. Pricing was one thing, but the other thing was also the fact that Travis was recently, well, not recently anymore, was acquired by another company, and they laid off. Apparently, they laid off a lot of the staff. So it did look like Travis's future was kind of like in flux. And when you want to start relying on a platform really heavily, the promise that it might not be around, or it might not be around in the state you've committed to, is kind of not really that much of a good feel. So a couple of friends, I think all friends from Melbourne actually, recommended this one called Buildkite. And Buildkite's actually by a Melbourne crew, which is amazing. And it's a bit different to things like Travis because it's not actually, it's a CI service, but you provide the hardware. It provides like the dashboard and the ability to manage things like compiled artifacts. So it manages the top layer really nicely. But at the low level, you actually have to provide the hardware, which I think is really good because it means that you can actually control everything in-house and the pricing is kind of stable. And it also gives you a much greater degree of control because you can actually see exactly from the ground level what's going on. And another good thing I liked about it was I do intend to start running unit tests on some of my old iOS devices. So you can actually, since you've got access to the build devices, you can plug in old legacy iOS devices and run unit tests on those directly. So I went and bought a Mac Mini at the end of 2018, and that thing's been my build server for the most part. And that thing's now taking over releasing all of my projects via Buildkite. That being said, when I started, I had no idea what I was doing in terms of Buildkite, but thankfully Buildkite has a really nice Slack. And I was able to go there and ask a huge amount of really silly noob questions, and they were very, very nice in getting back to me. And they actually pointed me in the right direction. I was able to start putting together how to actually do this sort of automation. So the first thing I did was I was still a bit nervous that letting an external online dashboard execute commands on my Mac Mini might be a security risk. So the first thing I did was I actually made a VM in Parallels and set the whole thing up in Parallels. So that thing completely separated itself from my normal operating system. So that alone meant there was no risk to getting keys or anything like that, which is, I think at the very bare minimum is a very good thing to do. Another thing you could do is maybe just have a separate user in macOS land, but I think Parallels, having a VM, running in a VM is definitely the smartest thing to do. Buildkite allows for things like separate organizations. So at the beginning, I was thinking maybe I should put every single repo in its own little organization, but that ended up being like way too complex. And so the Buildkite folks recommended you just have just give one organization a crazy name. I called mine XDCI, and every single repo can have a single pipeline in there. And that thing will take commands from the GitHub repo as needed and will execute as desired. The way I've done it was actually really simple. It doesn't actually do a lot. All it does is when you execute the build command, it uploads a file called pipeline.release.yaml. And the way that Buildkite works is it lets you configure its operations through this YAML file. So you can actually customize it on a per repo level. So the YAML file looks like this. And basically what it does is it sets up a bunch of environment variables like the repo name, where the pod spec file is, where the P list for the framework is. And then it executes this little command at the bottom that actually downloads and executes a bash script, which I'll explain in a sec. And then it executes, once that's done, it executes Fastlane, which I'll explain afterwards. So what that's actually doing is it's a short URL that downloads this install script. And all that does is make sure that bundler is installed. Actually, no, it assumes bundler is already installed, but then it goes through and downloads a common gem file, which includes all the dependencies like Fastlane and CocoaPods, and then downloads a common fast file and puts these all into the repo at build time. I hope I don't have to explain what Fastlane is. I need no introduction at this point, but in case people don't know what Fastlane is a really cool suite of command line utilities that automate basically every single facet of iOS development. So even things like updating pod specs or generating screenshots for builds and pushing things to App Store Connect. This thing is really, really, really useful in the fact that it trivializes the amount of work you have to do down to like one line of Ruby code. The question is, why did I go through all this effort of having a separate bash script and having a separate gem file? The main reason was originally I actually had a separate fast file in every single repo that I had. But the problem was that meant if I wanted to refine the build process for one, I didn't have to go through and re-push that to all of them. So what I'm actually trying to do here is I've got all the repos have is that one Buildkite pipeline file, but everything else is one centralized source. And because all the repos are set up in the same folder structure, all I need to do is specify the names of the actual project, and the same fast file can be applied to every single one of these repos, and the outcome is the same. So the fast file looks like this. It's pretty big, it's pretty long. I'll step through it really, really quickly, what each parts do, but it's all open source, so I'll give you the link at the end of this presentation. The way you trigger it, some people like to do triggers by when they tag a release in GitHub, but I wanted to make it a bit more manual than that, just so I could actually make sure that everything's lined up and I can actually do it explicitly. So the nice thing about Buildkite is you can manually trigger builds. It's just a big button that says new build. And so whenever I want to trigger a new release, I made sure everything's working and it's not crashing. I go in there and I create a message. Usually the message is just release and then the new version number that I want to release. And what happens is that goes through Buildkite's pipeline and then exposes it to the fast file. And so how the fast file works is, number one, is it extracts the version number from that message using a regular expression. And if it can't find one, it obviously fails out. Number two, it then opens a changelog and then does a more complex regular expression to go through the contents of the changelog and isolate the chunk of release notes just for this particular release. This is kind of manual. There are actually ways to automate generating changelogs, but they kind of required you to have formatted all your commit messages and pull requests nicely from the beginning, which a lot of these libraries I hadn't done. So in this case, I figured it would make more sense to explicitly enforce a changelog and at the same time explicitly enforce that you've added an explicit entry for this release in the changelog before it lets you proceed. Step three, taking that same version number, it then goes through the pod spec file and the info plist file and checks the version numbers in there. If they don't match, it updates them. And if either of them were out of date, then it actually commits those and then makes a push to master, this is the main amount of work because I kept forgetting to update the frameworks. So having this automated is my favorite bit. And basically, this is what it looks like from inside the app itself. Inside Xcode itself. Just updating the version number in the pod spec and the bundle version in the dynamic framework. After that, now that those things have been committed, now it's safe to actually tag the branches. This is another reason why I didn't want to rely on tagging, is because these two versions need to be up to date before the tag is applied. So this allows the explicit forcing of the ordering of which things get actually committed and etc. And then after that step, we take that chunk of the changelog that we extracted, and we actually make that a GitHub release. So we can actually make it a very nice formatted, accessible via the GitHub releases link, full-blown official release. And we can also upload it, not there at the moment, but additionally down the line, upload pre-compiled versions of the framework as well. And finally, the final step, once that's all done and everything's succeeded, we then make the push to CocoaPods trunk is the one that fails the most. So leaving this one at the end seemed to be the smartest thing to do. And once that's all done, we've successfully automated a release process, which is basically seven steps that you normally have to do manually, but that's all through one command on a website, which I could have done from my iPhone at a pub, which was the main priority here. And I'm really, really happy that it actually worked out like that. That being said, it's not perfect yet. There's still a lot of things I need to add. Like I just said, the ability to offer both static and dynamically compiled frameworks for Carthage, and if people want to install them manually, that's something I'm looking at the moment. I'm exploring whether it's worth still looking at fat binaries or if it's XC framework time. And this is particularly egregious. I've only looked at SPM, Swift Package Manager support, a little bit at this point, but I really need to get onto that and offer that in addition to CocoaPods and Carthage. In any case, the fast file and all my scripts are open source. The actual Buildkite pipelines aren't open, sorry, because they have my GitHub access token in there, so I can't really make that public. But definitely please check this out if you'd like to have a look. The code is in public domains. There's no licenses attached. Just go for broke if you want to give it a shot. And definitely check out Buildkite. I love it. I'm about to gear up a new app myself, and I'm going to run my entire CI through Buildkite. And I definitely recommend checking it out. It's also by Melbourne, so supporting local Melbourne software development is also really, really good. And that's basically everything. Thanks so much for watching. If you do have any questions, I'm in the Melbourne CocoaHeads Slack at the moment. But if you aren't in the Slack, you can also tweet at me at TimOliverAU. I think it's been clipped. But anyway, thanks again for watching, and I hope you learned something.